Today I'm taking a look at some more Hi-Fi. These are the QKZ VK1, which are a very reasonably priced IEM, coming in at just under $20. But are they any good? Well, that depends on how willing you are to do some tip rolling. So let's just get into it. Hey guys, this is Noel, and this is Wheezy Reviews, and each week I take a look at something audio related and let you know what I think. So if you're into that kind of thing, then make sure you subscribe. Also, I'm on Patreon now, so if you want to support the channel, then please check the links in the description, because making these videos takes a lot of time and money, and it would really help me out a lot. So these are the QKZ VK1, and I paid £15 for these from AliExpress, and they came with an upgraded cable. I'll talk a little bit more about the cable shortly. Now, there's quite a lot to talk about with these, despite them being such a cheap earphone, and there will be timestamps in the description if you want to skip around. Now, spec-wise, the VK1 feature a double dynamic driver with a graphene-coated diaphragm. They also have an impedance of 30 ohms and a sensitivity of 108 dB. And individually, each earpiece weighs just 4 grams, and that's with no tips. Looking at the marketing material for the VK1, you might get the impression that these use 4 dynamic drivers. They use terms like 4DD, 4D music, and coaxial 4 elements. However, whilst both earpieces combined might be 4 drivers, individually, these are double dynamic driver earphones. Also on the marketing and the packaging, we can see that these have been given high-res audio certification. If nothing else, that at least suggests that QKZ has a certain confidence in the driver of the VK1, which is also backed up by the claims that the VK1 are QKZ's custom flagship hi-fi headset. All this is to say that they certainly talk the talk, but do they walk the walk? First up, let's just take a look at the body of these earphones, which is made from polycarbonate. I have the clear version here, but they also come in a smoked black colorway. It looks like these use the same body shell as the TRN V10, which I also have on order, but they're not here just yet. But in fact, I suspect that the VK1s are actually made by TRN, and then the QKZ logo is just slapped on the side. The shape of these earpieces is this rather ergonomic shape, which somewhat reminds me of the TRN T200. And actually, I really like the shape, at least whilst being used with foam tips. I do like this little lip at the back here and the way that can hook into your ears. You also have a little bump at the front there as well. I do find that they fit into the ears quite well, they stay in place quite well, but your mileage may vary on that. And actually, I found it incredibly difficult to find a good fit when using these stock silicone tips. And despite their ergo shape, I didn't find that they really did that much for me when using the silicons. Now, in terms of tips, these do come with 3 pairs of silicone tips in your small, medium, and large sizes, pretty standard affair. Now, the listing for these also had a link to another listing with some foam tips, so I picked those up as well. I have heard tell that the VK1 are very, very tip sensitive, more so than other IEMs, and I have to say that I agree 100%. I did a lot of this review with the QKZ foam tips because I just did not get on with the fit using the silicone tips. Now, I've never really gotten on with silicone tips on any IEM, so perhaps I should just do all of my reviews with foam rather than stock tips. I think that most people will probably swap the tips on their IEMs to their preferred type anyway. And on a personal level, if any earphone doesn't work for me with foam tips, then it's just not the earphone for me. However, in the interests of completeness, I have done some listening with both the foam tips and the stock silicone tips. And I'm going to go into a lot more detail because I think tip choice is very, very important for these particular IEMs. Now, we should also take a look at the cables. So the stock cable that we've got here is, I think, rather lackluster. And I think that's often the case with these budget IEMs. And this one is very, very similar to the one that you get with the Blon BL-03. And similarly, this one also has these stiff ear hooks and this thin, plasticky feeling cable. The one I have here also has an inline microphone as well. Now, I did buy these in a bundle. As I previously mentioned, I bought these in a bundle with an aftermarket cable, an upgrade, which is this one here. And this cable is certainly nicer than the stock one, but it's still not especially a stellar cable. The ear hooks are still kind of stiff, although not quite as much as the stock cable. The braiding is also a little bit nicer, but it's nothing special. Now, there was a really obvious flaw with this one when I started using them, in that the left and the right channels had been swapped around. So even though they are marked left and right on the connectors here, they were actually on opposite sides. So as soon as I noticed that, I was able to just swap them over. So it was not a huge deal, but it's also not great. Now, also, crucially for me, both of these cables are missing a chin cinch bead like we have on the T4 here. I'm a big fan of a chin cinch because I find it helps greatly with the fit and comfort of any IM. And I've got a workaround in the form of a 2mm internal diameter silicon O-ring. So silicon O-rings to the rescue again for another IEM. And you just slide that over the cable, and then you can roll that up and down the cable in place of a bead. It's not ideal, but it gets the job done. Another quick look at the connector here. So this is a 2-pin 0.75mm pins, and this one is angled as well. I actually think that the angled helps with the fit when I'm using the foam tips, but I thought it actually got in the way when using the silicon tips. I found when using silicon tips, I needed to adjust the position of the IEM in my ears, rotate them back a little bit, I think, and the connector was then getting in the way. And in that case, I think using a straight connector would probably be a better choice. But again, your mileage is going to vary on this. No one's going to have the same fit in their ears. But it is just another interesting quirk with the fit of the VK1. Now onto sound, and before I get into it, all listening was done from my PC using a mix of Spotify and FLAC files through an O2 S-Stack. Also, a disclaimer that I've listened to this one pair of VK1, and therefore I cannot account for unit variance, and this was just my experience with this one particular unit. My reference earphone for all of this is the excellent TRN T4, which I'm wearing now. I'm also going to make comparisons with the Blon BL-03s, which seems to be everyone's favorite budget IEM at the moment. Now, both the TRN T4 and the Blon BL-03 were used with foam tips. And as I'm primarily interested in the performance of these using foam tips for fit and comfort reasons, as I've already mentioned, I'm going to be putting a particular focus on listening with foamies, but I'm also going to share my thoughts about the sound using the stock tips. So the QKZ VK1 with foam tips actually reminds me somewhat of the Blon BL-03, in that they have a rather bassy and rather dark overall sound signature, although I think they might even be even darker than the Blon BL-03s. They have a somewhat rolled off treble. In fact, by 11.5 kilohertz, it's basically completely rolled off, so you can throw that high-res certificate out of the window. As with the Blon, I don't have too much of an issue with this kind of signature for a casual portable earphone, especially at this price point. To the point that for my preferred casual walking around music, which is often lo-fi beats and stuff like that, this signature is completely acceptable. However, when it comes to anything any more involved than casual beats, they do start to show their weakness and their lack of detail. Again, that is quite similar to the Blon BL-03. However, as I'll get into a little bit later, I think that this is a superficial comparison and about as far as the similarities with the Blon BL-03 as it goes. In terms of bass, these have a decent deep extension with a lot of authority, perhaps down to 30 hertz before I noticed it roll off. However, they also sound rather boosted and even a bit bloated. And whilst I don't find them to be overly boomy in most tracks, it does tend to lean towards muddiness. However, this does seem to be a lot more controlled when using silicon tips. Now, either way, whilst the bass has authority, it does lack impact and slam capability. The mids are suffering from bass bleed in the low mids and that bloated, boosted bass sound. There's no upper mid shout, but they do sound a little bit dark and restrained there. And once again, there's actually quite a difference when using silicon tips. In fact, I could hear quite a bit more energy in the upper mids, similarly to the TRN T4, albeit not quite to the same extent. And again, with the foams, treble is really rather restrained, and it does sound like it rolls off a fair bit, particularly after around 8 kilohertz, it just starts to roll off. Like I said, by 11.5, it's completely gone. Although, again, with the silicon tips, the treble rolls off a lot less and actually has some detail and sparkle that is otherwise lacking with the foams. There's even a little bit more extension into the air frequencies. So you should have an idea by now that the QKZ VK1 changes to a completely different earphone when swapping between silicon and foam tips. This is night and day. Now, speaking of timbre and tonality, these have a pretty good and natural presentation and nothing sounds off, so no complaints there. But for soundstage and imaging, much like the Blon BL-03s, these are probably quite average. And whilst the TRN T4 isn't entirely stellar in this respect, they still beat the VK1s. On to some examples from my reference tracks. Again, foam tips first and silicon tips after. So Hotel California by the Eagles, the QKZ VK1 has a much warmer intro than the T4. The bass is much bigger, it's more full, but almost the point of bloating, and the guitar here is really quite overpowered by the bass. There's less of that balance of guitar, bass, and percussion that you would get on the T4. And speaking of the guitar, you also don't get that same level of sparkle and shimmer from the high end of the 12-string, which leaves it sounding a little bit muted. Now, it should be noted that the Blon BL-03 actually does manage to do some pretty good justice to this guitar, unlike the VK1s with the foams. So bass is quite a bit more forwards than the guitar. Toms, they're also quite forwards as well, and the kick has also got quite a lot of authority, but it doesn't quite have the same sort of punch to it. The vocals are also, I think, a little bit back in the mix as well. So far, not looking good for the VK1s. The electric guitar lead at 4 minutes and 20 has a really great thick tone, actually, that I really quite like. However, it's not really, it just doesn't cut through the mix. Whereas on both the T4 and the BL3s, this is brighter and much more cutting. In fact, surprisingly, on the BL3s, it has both that thick warm tone and enough brightness to cut through the mix. And I was actually surprisingly impressed with the BL3's performance. Overall, the T4 has the best reproduction of this track and is much more balanced with the more detailed and neutral presentation. The VK1 is coming off with a much darker and more relaxed and casual reproduction. And actually, the BL3 fits more in that fun sweet spot for a casual earphone, which actually was quite enjoyable. And having said all of that, I had a completely different experience with the stock silicon tips. Most notably in that 12-string, which actually had a nice bit of sparkle and shimmer in the high end. With the silicon tips, this is a lot closer to the T4 in terms of sound signature. In fact, on a sine sweep, I could even hear a certain amount of energy around 5 kHz, which is just like the tin T4, although not quite to the same extent. Now, also, unlike the foam tips, they don't simply start to roll off at 8 kHz and actually had a little bit more detail and sparkle in the upper treble and air frequencies. The difference between tips on the VK1 is not at all subtle. This is a huge change. Moving on to some jazz, so Moanin by Charles Mingus. The opening sax sounds big and full with this good reproduction of the reverb, and when the bass starts, it is much bigger and fuller and warmer than on the T4. Now, whilst this does bring that bass quite forwards, it tends to interfere with all the other instruments, which can make the song sound somewhat busy and somewhat muddy and indistinct. There's a certain amount of musicality that is quite enjoyable in that really casual way. It just lacks some of that low-end clarity that you get with the T4, and you lose a lot of detail and instrument separation. In terms of overall tonality, I think the T4 and the VK1 have a similar sound, and that's to say that nothing sounds really off with the VK1. But jazz is really all about detail. It's rhythm and instruments playing off of each other, and the VK1 is really not doing it justice. However, the tin T4 is stealing the show, and I was actually struggling to stay focused on my review and not get lost in the music. Once again, the VK1 is a totally different beast with the silicon tips. There's some good detail and clarity in the low end, there's much more instrument separation, there's a much more accurate reproduction of this track. So far, they're not bad with the silicon tips, and I'd be quite happy if I could actually tolerate the fit. But with foam tips, I don't necessarily think this earphone excels at this sort of rock and jazz. So I'm going to move on to some other stuff that these are probably more suited to. So let's talk about Polaris by Deadmau5. The intro is much, much warmer. That pad synth is big and full compared to the T4. When the delayed synth stabs start, they sound a little bit muted and thick. There's much less of that clarity that you get with the T4, but the bass at least does sound huge. When the synth melody starts, it's big and full, basically a huge, warm wall of sound. And when the kick starts at 2 minutes and 37, it's way bigger than it is on the T4, but it's a lot less impactful. It actually has a little bit more punch on the T4. And again, at 3 minutes and 7, when the track really thickens up, it's got a huge sound on these. However, on the Blon BL-03, that is not only a huge bass sound and a huge kick, but it also has a lot more slam and impact. Also, the synth stabs at the high end with the VK1 have a lot less sparkle, and whilst this track does have this warm and bassy sound, it really just lacks the top-end energy for balance. And I should note again that the Blon BL-03 has much more top-end energy here than the VK1, and it does have that balance. But as we build up to the drop at 6 minutes and 30, so for the minute leading up to that, the track really thickens up and starts adding layer upon layer, and it just turns into a muddy soup. In terms of this track, I would have to pick the Blon BL-03 over both the TRN T4 and the QKZ VK1. And this is simply because the TRN T4 is a much more neutral and bass-like presentation, and I think EDM requires a bit more bass and energy, and the BL-03 has that in spades. The VK1 absolutely piles on that low-end warmth, and it also lacks that upper-end sparkle, leaving them somewhat muddy and lifeless. But again, there's a big difference with the silicon tips. They actually, I think, sit somewhere between the TRN T4 and the Blon BL-3s. They have a bit more warmth and fullness than the T4, but a lot less of the slam and impact of the Blon, and even the T4. I'd still give it to the Blon BL-03 here purely for enjoyment, but the VK1 does a respectable job. So what about hip-hop? I listened to a few tracks off of the Low End Theory by A Tribe Called Quest, and we're back on the foam tips. Bass is much bigger, has much more authority, it's warmer, and it has a much more full sound than the T4, but to the point of being a bit boomy and muddy. The snare hits here are incredibly restrained. Now, sure, they could be a little bit harsh on the T4 at times, but this is the complete polar opposite. The VK1 does have a more relaxed and chill sound, which does suit the style somewhat, and I think I would probably pick the VK1 over the T4 for this type of music. However, once again, the Blon BL-03 blows them both out of the water. The Blon has a huge but articulate bass and much more impact to the drums and more slam to the kick. There's enough energy at the upper end for a good snappy snare attack. It's not too forwards and harsh, and the vocals are decently present, and the whole thing has a big warmth without being muddy, unlike on the VK1. Once again, I'll take the Blon BL-03, please. However, yet again, the VK1 is an entirely different beast with the silicon tips. The bass extends deep into the sub-bass territory, but it has less of that huge bloated wall of warmth. I would probably still take the Blons for this style, but dare I say that with the silicon tips, the VK1 sounds like a slightly more bassy, but slightly less detailed TRN T4. All in then, even with the silicon tips, I don't think they beat the T4 in terms of detail, although they do a pretty good job, and they are perhaps a little less shouty than the T4. However, with the foam tips, they have a more relaxed and casual sound signature rather than the neutral presentation. This is probably an unfair point of comparison, as the T4 is 6 or 7 times the price of the VK1. The better point of comparison is the Blon BL-03, and at less than twice the price, don't forget we're talking about an IEM that costs around $20 versus the sub $30 of the BL-03. We're not talking about a huge price difference here. I cannot tolerate using these without foam tips, and I don't like their sound when I am using foam tips. So unfortunately, on a personal level, the VK1 is out. If foam tips are your thing too, then you should avoid the VK1, I think. The Blon BL-03 would probably be a better choice for a fun, casual earphone, although tweaking tip fit with those is also quite necessary, as I mentioned in my review of those. If you are okay with silicon tips or you're okay with experimenting with different types of tips until you find the right ones, you could probably end up with a reasonably neutral earphone here with a decent amount of bass extension for a low price. And actually, I did find the VK1 with silicon tips to sound surprisingly good, if only I could just get on with the fit. In summary, the QKZ VK1 is a very cheap IEM at sub £15 or $20. They have an ergonomic and lightweight design and a sound signature with a good amount of sub-bass extension that either has a relaxed sound signature that is really only somewhat acceptable for very casual modern genres with foam tips, or a better and more neutral-leaning sound signature with silicon tips. I think these would work quite well as a cheap spare IEM for commuting, for example, one that you don't mind losing. But listen closely or listen to some more well-recorded music and the failings do start to become a bit more obvious. And I suppose that is really to be expected for the price point. But really, I think the biggest hurdle for these in terms of sound quality and comfort is all in the tips. For this price, it is hard to diss them too much. But I'm going to have a lot more videos coming up soon with some more sub £30, $30 IEMs. And I think there's a lot of good stuff out there. So stay tuned for that. Also, I have the TRN V10 on order, which uses the same body shell and double dynamic driver, but also adds double balanced armatures as well. I do hope that the tuning and addition of the balanced armatures will make them sound better with foam tips, but we're really going to have to wait and see. Right, that's about all I have to say about the QKZ VK1, and if you like this video, then make sure you leave a like, and if you haven't already, then please consider subscribing. And if you like what I'm doing and you want to support the channel, then check down in the description for some links. I'm on Patreon now, so if you want to get in on that, get access to the Discord, and get your name right over here, it would really help me out quite a lot, and allow me to continue bringing more content in the future. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, have a good one.